The kitchen was dark when I woke, and cold the way only November mornings are cold when the fire has been out all night. I had been lying awake since before 4. I stayed very still in that bed, listening to the breathing beside me, and I thought about something I had not allowed myself to think about for 60 years, until I began to write it down. The man sleeping beside me was my first cousin, Jonas. We had sat across from each other at Sunday dinners since we were very small children. I had watched him lose his 2 front teeth when he was 6 years old. He had seen me fall out of the oak tree at the far edge of my father's property when I was 9. And he had laughed until the tears ran down his face. And now he was my husband. We had been married for exactly 1 day. I got up carefully so as not to wake him. And I did something that morning I have never told another living soul. Not my daughters, not my sisters, not my friend Ruth, who knew more about me than almost anyone alive. I have carried it for 63 years. I am ready to tell it now. Before I do, my name is Anna, and this is Anna the Amish grandmother. I grew up Old Order Amish in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and I am 81 years old. I share the stories my community taught me. I should carry in silence to my grave. If you want to hear what was buried inside the plain houses for generations, subscribe to this channel and like this video. And tell me in the comments, did you know that first cousin marriages were practiced openly in some Amish settlements as recently as 60 years ago? Tell me what you knew and what surprised you. I read every single one now. Let me take you back. It was 1961. I was 17 years old. In my community, there was no particular shame in marrying a cousin. I want you to understand this clearly, because from the outside it sounds impossible. From the inside, it was simply how the world was arranged. The Old Order Amish world is a small world by design. Small and deliberate, built to remain that way. The same families had farmed the same Lancaster County land for 100 years. The same surnames appear on the same church ledgers, generation after generation. Stoltzfus, Lapp, Baylor King. The bloodlines were not wide rivers. They were narrow, slow creeks, winding very close together, for as long as anyone could remember. Our church district had no written prohibition against first cousins marrying. The Ordnung, our unwritten but absolute code of community life, which governed everything from the width of a hat brim to the color of a dress, to the proper distance between a young man and a young woman in a courting buggy, said nothing directly on the matter. What the Ordnung did govern, completely and without exception, was the authority of fathers who arranged a marriage, and how that arrangement was finalized. A father's word was not a suggestion. It was a settling of things. The practice was not spoken of openly, even within the community itself. It was simply done. A cousin married a cousin. The families drew their properties and their lives more tightly together, and the church district drew a little more closed around itself. There was something the district understood without ever saying it aloud. A small world stays small, in part, by marrying within itself, by keeping what it has, by not losing its daughters to men from the English world, or from distant settlements they cannot watch over. Every marriage within the family was a door sealed against the outside, and a sealed door in the Ordnung was not a problem. It was a virtue. I had grown up absorbing this without anyone explaining it to me directly. You take it in the way you take in the language. Through watching, through understanding early on that certain questions simply are not asked. By the time something is decided for a girl in an Amish household, it has already passed through her father and her bishop and her community, and arrived as something complete, not a discussion, an announcement. My father and Jonas's father were brothers. They had farmed neighboring land their whole lives, fence lines touching, families sharing every Sunday and every funeral and every frolic for as far back as either man could remember. At some point, in conversations I was never part of and was never told the details of, they decided their children were well matched, that joining the two households would be good for the family, good for the land, good for the church community that would bless it. Nobody asked me. I want to say that plainly, not with bitterness, but as a fact. There was no evening where my father sat, with the lamp between us, and asked, "What do you want for your life, Anna?" The Ordnung did not make space for that question. A young woman's thus wants were a small thing against a family's plan and a community's order. I was not threatened or struck or unkindly spoken to. I was simply informed, one evening at supper in the fall of 1960, that Jonas had spoken to my father. My father had agreed, and the wedding would be the following November. I was 16 at that supper. I turned 17 the following spring. I had almost a full year to understand what my life was going to be. Jonas was 21. He was a decent young man, and I want to be plain about that. He had the same broad forehead I recognized from my father's side of the family. The same habit of going very quiet when he was thinking something through. He was a hard worker. Everyone in the district said so. He had already been running much of his father's farm for several years, and knew that land the way you can only know, land you have loved since childhood. But he was also the boy I had grown up alongside. We had caught frogs together in the creek behind the barn when we were 8 years old. We had sat at the same grandmother's table every Christmas of my life, and there is a particular strangeness in looking at a person you know that deeply and trying to rearrange them inside your own mind into something entirely new, into a husband, into the person who will sleep beside you for the rest of your living life. I tried. I want to be honest about the trying. During that year between the supper and the wedding, Jonas visited on Sunday evenings. We sat in my parents' front room with the lamp between us and talked, mostly about practical things. The house his father was helping him build on the south end of the property, the cows he planned to buy in the spring, how many acres he thought he could put to corn. We talked around the center of things, the way you walk carefully around a hole in a floor you are both afraid to name. Once I overheard Jonas speaking to his younger brother in the barn. Not knowing I was on the other side of the wall, he said simply, "She is good," meaning me. "She is quiet and she works hard." He said nothing more than that. I stood in the dark with my hand on a post, and tried to decide whether being called quiet and hard-working was something to feel glad about. I decided that it was. I did not know yet that it was one of the saddest compliments a young man could give the woman he was about to marry. Let me step out of this story for a moment. I want to say something to the woman who has come this far. I think she has spent a great many of her years doing what was expected of her. For the household, for the husband, for the children and the church. Before she ever stopped to ask what she herself might want. I know that life. I lived most of mine inside it. What I learned after, finding my way slowly back to myself, I wrote down in a small book. 4 weeks, 1 step at a time. The years that are still yours. The link is in the first comment of this video, if any of what I said belongs to you. Now back to the story. My friend Ruth had married the year before me, at 19, to a young man from a neighboring district. Someone she had met at Sunday singings and chosen, or as close to chosen as our world allowed. She told me many years later that she had watched my engagement unfold with a dread she didn't have words for at the time. We were women in our 30s when she finally told me, standing in her kitchen with flour on our hands and bread rising on the counter. She said it simply. I was afraid for you. I did not know how to say so then. I had not known. Nobody had said it. That is the nature of a world built on silence. Fear moves through it, the way heat moves through the walls of an old house. You feel it without ever finding the source. But it is never named. Naming it would have been hogmutt, pride. The placing of your own unease above the community's order and God's plan. The wedding was announced in church on a Sunday morning in September. The community received it the way the community receives all settled things, with quiet approval. A few of the older women nodded. A few of the men shook my father's hand after the service. Life went on exactly as it had been, because this was exactly as it had been. A girl was marrying her cousin. It was not the first time. It would not be the last. The wedding was on a Thursday in early November, after the harvest was in. Nearly 300 people filled my parents' house and barn. The benches were arranged from the front room, through the kitchen, and down the hall, and still some of the older men stood along the walls. The bishop preached for nearly 3 hours on Gelassenheit, yielding, on the submission of a wife, on building a godly household, on surrendering to a plan larger than the self. I sat in my plain blue dress on the women's side, and I listened, and I noted, as I had noted many times before, that the sermon said a great deal about what a wife owed, and very little about what a wife might need. The meal was roast chicken and mashed potatoes with gravy, the color and thickness of river clay, creamed celery, pepper cabbage, and the apple pies my aunts had been baking for 3 days. The house smelled like wood smoke and coffee, and something faintly sweet in the cooling pies, covering every flat surface in the kitchen. My cheeks ached from the steady smiling that was expected of me. Jonas sat across the long table, eating carefully, his eyes moving to my face once, and then away again, like a man checking the road ahead for ice. When the last guests had gone, and the house settled into its night sounds, the creak of the old floorboards cooling, the distant shift of horses in the barn. Jonas and I went upstairs. I want to be honest about what that room looked like, because the details still matter to me. A plain wooden bed with a headboard Jonas's father had built. A quilt my grandmother had pieced from old dress scraps, navy blue and brown, and a particular deep green I have never been able to find again in 60 years of looking. A wash basin with cool water on the stand beside the bed, no mirror, no lock on the door. Through the floorboards below us, I could still hear my mother in the kitchen, the quiet, familiar sounds of her putting the last things away for the night. We had grown up together. That is what is hardest to explain to someone who did not live it. We had shared every family table, spoken the same Pennsylvania Dutch, with the same grandparents, recognized the same family face in each other, since before we were old enough to know what recognition was. And now we stood in that small room and looked at each other. And what passed between us was not the uncertainty of strangers. It was something stranger than that. The uncertainty of two people who know each other too well and not at all in the way that moment required. He said quietly, "I don't know how to do this right." I know, I told him. That was the whole of it. We were not romantic. We were two young people carrying out an obligation that had been handed to us like a piece of inherited farm equipment. Necessary, large, and entirely unchosen. There was care in Jonas. I want to say that. He was careful with me, deliberate, and when I made a sound he could not read, he stopped and waited. That carefulness was the kindness he had to offer, and he offered it. What happened in that room I will keep private, as is proper. What I will say is that it was gentle, and it was sad, and when it was over the room went very quiet, and I lay there looking at the ceiling, and I found myself thinking about the creek behind the barn and the frogs. And the summer we were 8 years old. It is a strange thing to lie beside someone you have known your whole life and feel more completely alone than you have ever been. At some point, Jonas's breathing deepened and slowed. I waited until I was certain. Then I got up. I did not light the lamp. I felt my way to the door, down the stairs. 12 steps. I had counted them 1,000 times as a girl. Through the kitchen, cold now with the fire banked for the night, and out the back door into the November dark. The cold came all at once. I was in my nightgown, my feet bare on the frozen ground. The sky was that flat gray that comes before a winter dawn. No stars, no color, no warmth anywhere in it. I could hear the horses in the barn shifting their weight, their breathing, moving steadily through the wooden walls like something patient and alive. I kept walking anyway, past the barn, through the garden put to bed for winter, past the woodpile stacked high against the coming months, along the fence line where the grass had gone hard and brown and crunched beneath each step. I walked to the oak tree at the far edge of my father's land. I had climbed that tree 1,000 times as a girl. It was the place I went when I needed to be nowhere anyone could find me. Up in the branches in summer, looking out over the fields, believing the way children believe, simply and entirely, that the world was very large and that I would one day see more of it. I stood at the base of it in the dark and put both hands flat against the bark. Old bark, rough and cold and familiar, I held on. I did not cry. I had already done that weeks before the wedding, alone in the outhouse in the dark, where no one would hear me. I had used what crying I had. What I did instead was stand there, with my hands on that old tree, and I let myself be nobody's wife for 20 minutes. Nobody's cousin, nobody's daughter or church member or bride, just Anna. Just the girl who had climbed this tree and believed once that her life was going to be very large. Then I walked back inside, lit the fire, and started the breakfast. Nobody ever knew I had gone out. Nobody asked. The morning proceeded the way Amish mornings do. Animals to feed. Guests who had stayed the night needing breakfast. Dishes from the day before still wanting washing. I moved through all of it. I poured the coffee. I cut the bread. I answered when spoken to and smiled the right number of times. And something in me had made a quiet decision, standing at that oak tree in the dark. I could not have named it at 17. It would be decades before I had the language. But it was there beneath everything I did that morning, like a seed pressed into frozen ground. I had claimed 20 minutes that belonged only to me, and I would find a way across the long years ahead to claim more. Jonas and I were married for 22 years before I left. I want to say that carefully, because I know what some of you will hear in it. 22 years is not nothing. We raised 4 children on that farm. We built something together, a house, a life, a shape of days that had real dignity in it. There were mornings I watched Jonas work and felt a genuine tenderness for the man he was. There were winters when we sat by the stove after the children were asleep and talked honestly about the things that frightened us. And those conversations were real. They mattered. But there is a difference between a life that is real and a life that was chosen. I did not understand that difference for a very long time, because I had never been offered a choice to understand it by. You cannot miss what has never been placed before you. Or rather, you miss it the way you miss a word you do not yet have. A reaching towards something you cannot name because it has never been shown to you. I found the word eventually. The word was mine. When I left at 40, the shunning came quickly. Letters returned unopened. The door of my childhood home, silent when I stood before it. I had expected the shunning. Everyone in the community knows what follows when you leave. What I had not expected was the grief of it. How complete the loss was. How much of myself had been built inside those walls. You can know that a wall has been holding you back and still mourn it when it comes down. Here is what I understand now that I could not at 17. The world I grew up in was not malicious. My father was not a villain. The bishop was not a cruel man. They were all living faithfully inside a structure built over centuries, built on the conviction that individual desire was dangerous, that the community's order was holy, that yielding was the path to God, and that a young woman's consent was not something requiring formal consideration, because the community itself, in its certainty, was looking after her. They believed this entirely, without hesitation or irony, and that belief produced a world in which a 17-year-old girl could be given to her own cousin and understand, without anyone ever saying it to her directly, that there was no door in her own life she was permitted to open for herself. My therapist, years after I left, asked me what I felt on that morning after the wedding. I told her I didn't feel anything. I was too busy. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "I think you felt a great deal. I think you had simply been taught your whole life to treat your own feelings as a luxury you were not permitted to have." That landed in me like a stone dropped into still water. I have felt the rings spreading outward ever since. If you grew up in a house where the most important decisions of your life were made in rooms you were not in, by people certain they knew what was best for you, I see you. If you have spent years calling that arrangement gratitude, because at least he was decent, at least they meant well, at least no one raised a hand, I see you. You are not wrong for the grief of it. What was decided about your life without asking you mattered. And it is not too late, not at 60, not at 70, not at 80, to begin asking yourself what you actually want. I was nearly 70 before I first stood inside a life that felt entirely mine. You do not have to wait that long. That is the one thing I am certain of. If you stayed all the way through, thank you. I came to my own life late. You do not have to. The years that are still yours, it is all there in the first comment of this video. And that is all I have. Until next time, the years in front of you are still yours. Spend them on yourself.